We were group 5 and we had interpreter of maladies. And in the group is Emily Kraft, Emily Combus, and Maddie Fields.
Okay, starting off, I had biographical lens, and opening with that is the history of the author, Jhumpa Lahiri. She's an English-born American novelist and short story writer. She was born in 1967 in London, England, to her parents, Amar and Tapti Lahir. Her father was a university librarian, and then her mother was a school teacher, so that kind of plays into the role of her being a writer and who she is now. She moved to Rhode Island at a young age, but her parents nevertheless continued to install the Indian culture when raising her. For example, as she went to American school, she was encouraged to keep her family name Jhumpa through grade school, which she did. Then in 1989, Lahiri graduated from Barnard College, earning her BA in English Lit. Then 3 master's degrees from Boston College in English, creative writing, and comparative literature. And lastly, but certainly not least, a doctorate in Renaissance Studies from Boston University. Okay, next we have the history of the author contribution. Interpreter of Maladies was one of 9 debut collections of short stories released by Lahiri. The 9 short stories consisted of a mix between the United States and Indian culture. For example, a common theme one will recognize when reading Lahiri's story is arranged marriage, which is obviously from the Indian culture, and then American style, and then the obvious one, Indian culture. Lahiri's short stories won her the 2000 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and then the 2000 PEN and Hemingway Award for debut fiction. And then after she wrote her 9 short stories, she took about a 3-year break, moving on to The Namesake in 2003, The Unaccustomed Earth in 2008, and then The Island Lowland in 2013. And then in 2015 and through 2018, she moved on to writing her first book in Italian. Lahiri looks at the Italian language as the love language. Moving on in the biographical lens, I went and touched on Mr. and Mrs. Das as a reflection of the time period. And during this time, Interpreter of Maladies was written in 1999. The 90s was a period labeled by the emerging cultures, which is seen in Lahiri's stories with the contrasting Indian and American culture. And just a little overview, a little bit about the 90s. It was the ultimate jump in fashion technology. There was music, which consisted of a grunge theme, which promoting alienation, neglectance, and desire for freedom. And I felt like that kind of influenced the 90s, influenced Mr. and Mrs. Das characters. By one, you can see where Mrs. Das is speaking to Mr. Kapasi. I have terrible urges, Mr. Kapasi, to throw things away. And for that fact, it kind of shows me, like, you can definitely see where women are breaking through during this time, not like before, a little bit before this time where, you never really had a woman, up and leaving the family. It was usually the stereotype where she'd stay home, take care, etc., etc. And then, you can see another part or another quote of Mr. Kapasi talking about Mr. and Mrs. Das bickering about who should take to the toilet. And my personal opinion, when a kid has to pee, they have to pee. But I felt like it was kind of like neglectance playing in this role. I mean, of course, parents, argue, bicker. But I mean, the kid had to pee. And then lastly, he had a sapphire blue visor and was dressed in shorts, sneakers, and a t-shirt, and camera slung around his neck. And for that fact, I felt like 90s was written all over it, because come on, visor, dressed in shorts, sneakers, and a t-shirt, and then a camera. Usually nowadays you just throw out your phone, and that's that. Okay, mix / comparison of cultures. I kind of wanted to touch on how the author kind of, combines American culture and Indian culture, which is kind of one of the main themes of all her short stories and whatnot. So throughout Lahiri's life, she moved quite a bit, embracing the various cultures around her, because again, just a little reminder, she was born in London in 1967. Jahumba Lahiri immigrated with her Bengali parents to Boston and then Kingston, Rhode Island. And for that fact, I feel like it plays a big role in her stories. And then side note too, it just kind of shows you what kind of person Lahiri is, because I think that's so cool and respectful that she stayed educated everywhere she went. But anyways, moving on, a little bit of the mix, kind of showing you like the difference between American and Indian culture. You can see Mr. Kapazi says, but Mr. Das squeezed hands like an American so that Mr. Kapazi felt it in his elbow. I kind of felt like there must be a difference in handshakes that Lahiri felt with the Indian culture and the American culture, so I thought that was kind of neat. And then next, the family looked Indian but dressed as foreigners did, the children in stiff, brightly colored clothing and caps with translucent visors. Obviously, that's a mix, because looking at the American culture and how they dress, it's kind of out there, like boom. But moving on to the comparisons, the idea one will never be happy. You can see how the narrator talks about Kapazi and how he wondered if Mr. and Mrs. Das were a bad match, just as he and his wife were. In the Indian culture, you usually see a lot of arranged marriages. And for that fact, that automatically put a strain on Mr. and Mrs. Kapazi, or Mr. Kapazi's wife, because he didn't really know her. It was kind of arranged, And then to add on top of that, their son died. So it was just kind of from the start not going to work. It was just going to be unhappy. But next, about the idea that one will never be happy, it kind of compares to Mr. and Mrs. Das. Because, a quote, she made no protest when the friend touched the small of her back. That refers to how Mrs. Das slept with her husband's friend while he was gone away at work. And it relates to one of the biggest secrets of the story. So lastly, touching on the women of the story and the creator and the actual character, Miss Das and Lahiri. In many ways, Lahiri plays her personal life through her short stories, such as one, again, incorporating her Indian culture, which I could say that a million times over and over, because that's just such a major fact that when you read Lahiri's stories, you're going to see the Indian culture, which I think is pretty neat. But also something I realized throughout the story is you'll see a lot of the women, like she's touching on women in her life throughout. For example, when Mrs. Das was telling Mr. Kapazi that she was a middle school teacher, Miss Lahiri, her mom's an actual middle school teacher, so I thought that was cool to see actual family life in the story. And then next, a quote saying New Brunswick, New Jersey, next to New York, when Miss Das was saying where they're from. If you look at New York, I think that's where Barnard College is located, which is actually where Lahiri went. And I thought it was also a neat idea that she stayed in her story all close to where she was at. New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, etc. And then lastly, Miss Das had three children, 2 boys and 1 girl. And if you look into Lahiri's personal life, she has children. So I thought it was cool to kind of put that mother life on her characters as well. To finish the biographical lens, I have the analysis questions. One being, what was Lahiri's goal by having Miss Das tell Mr. Kapazi her personal lifelong secret? And then secondly, how do you think Lahiri represented the current timeline 1999 in the short story interpreter of Maladies?
Next is the psychological lens. Starting with Mrs. Das, from the beginning of the story, it is clear that Mrs. Das, or Mina, does not exhibit the maternal qualities that most are accustomed to from mothers. She did not hold the little girl's hand as they walked to the restroom. As opposed to other mothers, Mrs. Das's behaviors towards her children and husband are considered abnormal, considering that she shows clear disdain for them and she gives little emotion in their interactions with one another. When most people think of motherly figure, they imagine someone with nurturing tendencies, which Mrs. Doss didn't display in the poem. "Leave me alone," Mrs. Doss said, blowing on her nail and turning her body slightly. "You're making me mess up." Mrs. Doss's interactions with her own children display her deep-rooted resentment towards them and her limited choices for the future that they represent. Mrs. Doss's resentment of her husband in particular stemmed from the limited options being with him presented. They'd grown up together and got married very young, but slowly over time her affection towards him had slipped away. As a result of spending all her time in college with Raj, she continued, she had not made many close friends. There was no one to confide in about him at the end of a difficult day, or to share a passing thought or worry. So Mrs. Doss's choice to be with her husband and start a family at a young age made it to where she was deprived social interaction, and led her to blame them for that. Having a child so quickly and nursing and warming up bottles of milk and testing their temperature against her wrist, while Raj was at work, dressed in sweaters and corduroy pants, teaching his students about rocks and dinosaurs. After becoming a mother, Mrs. Doss had to be home all the time, while her husband was working. He got to do things and have freedom that she didn't. Her suppressed dreams that didn't get to become a reality upon having children led her to resent her family as well as exhibit jealousy of her husband's freedom. Mrs. Doss's guilt over her infidelity and paranoia that anyone in her life would find out about her son's real father played a big factor in why she is so hostile towards her family. "I feel terrible looking at my children, and at Raj, always terrible. I have terrible urges, Mr. Kapasi, to throw things away. One day I had the urge to throw everything I own out the window, the television, the children, everything. Don't you think it's unhealthy?" This quote alludes to Mrs. Doss's deep-rooted psychological issues because she got so fed up with her life that she actually considered throwing away everything, including her children. He looked at her in her red plain skirt and strawberry t-shirt, a woman not yet 30 who loved neither her husband nor her children, who had fallen out of love with life. This quote shows the audience that Mrs. Doss was very unhappy with her life, which could have been because she had a fear that upon becoming a mother, she was never going to get anything more out of life that she wanted. Moving on to Mr. Kapasi. Mr. Kapasi, the tour guide for the Doss family, becomes an outlet for Mrs. Doss to confide in throughout the poem, but he is struggling with his own internal duress by not feeling like what he does matters, and as if he fits nowhere. This ultimately led him to feel hopelessness, and as if he were unimportant. Mr. Kapasi had never thought of his job in such complimentary terms. To him it was a thankless job. The job was a sign of his failings. These quotes illustrate that even though Mr. Kapasi is helping the doctor speak to patients, he never saw it as a job that was important. He was too focused on his inability to accomplish his dream of being an international translator, but he chose to believe what he did didn't matter until Mrs. Doss seemed impressed by it. Mr. Kapasi's fear of not being as important as he dreamed is only confirmed when his wife tells him what she thinks of his job as an interpreter for a doctor. She felt resentment towards patients that he helped because it brought back painful memories of her son. Mr. Kapasi knew that his wife had little regard for his career as an interpreter. He knew it reminded her of the son she had lost, and that she resented the other lives that he helped in his own small way to save. For this reason, it flattered Mr. Kapasi that Mrs. Doss was so intrigued by his job. These quotes show that there had been so few people who had openly told Mr. Kapasi that he was doing a good job, which led him to have self-doubt and deep-rooted insecurities. This made his affection for Mrs. Doss so intense because she was validating him when so many people, including himself, thought what he did and who he was wasn't important. Moving on to the author's literary contributions. When Lahiri wrote this poem, she represented Mrs. Doss as an antagonist who only cared about herself until the end of the poem when one of her children was being hurt. Mrs. Doss, for most of the poem, resented her family and let her lack of fulfillment in life turn her into a bitter person. However, one of the most prominent psychological maladies that Mrs. Doss exhibited was her fear and guilt. Lahiri's description of Mrs. Doss and the guilt that had constantly caused her pain could be consistent with some of Lahiri's own internal struggles with guilt and fear. Lahiri describes Mr. Kapasi as a man who never fulfilled his dreams and who let self-doubt cloud self-image. He had a hard time seeing how he was important because he was never told that he was. In Lahiri's biography, it mentioned her not feeling like she ever belonged anywhere, which is reflected in Mr. Kapasi, who didn't feel as if he belonged anywhere or that what he did for a living was important. For my analysis questions, my first question is, how does Mrs. Doss's guilt of infidelity and lack of fulfillment result in the resentment of her husband and children? And what behaviors towards her family depict this most clearly? And my second question is, at paragraph 105, the author says, in its own way, this correspondence would fulfill his dream of serving as an interpreter between nations, referring to the letters Mr. Kapasi fantasized writing to Mrs. Doss. How can Mrs. Doss fulfill his dream of combining two nations? And how do his subconscious dreams affect his behavior towards Mrs. Doss?
Next is the gender feminist lens. Since the author is a woman, this greatly influences her depiction of each of the characters in the story. Starting with Miss Doss. Miss Doss is depicted as a more hands-off mother and at times is seen as cold towards her children. As soon as the car began to move, the little girl began to play with the lock on her side, clicking it with some effort forward and backward. But Miss Doss said nothing to stop her. She sat a bit slouched at one end of the back seat, not offering her puffed rice to anyone. So this is showing that Miss Doss is not very concerned with what her daughter's doing, and she's not willing to share her rice. And earlier we see that Miss Doss is telling her daughter to leave her alone while she's painting her nails. And so typically a mother is thought of as a more warm and comforting figure in a child's life. But the author chooses to deviate from this stereotype when describing Miss Doss in order to show that Miss Doss is not happy with her life. She's not putting any effort forward in her marriage or to her children. However, Miss Doss is a more traditional mother in the sense that she stayed at home to take care of her children and she wasn't going out as much. But this caused her to not be happy with her life because she lost friends and she wasn't able to work and do something that she really, really loved. So the author is trying to comment on the fact that being a stay-at-home mom is not always the best, even though it's traditionally what is thought to be best for the child. Next up is Mr. Doss and gender. So Mr. Doss is portrayed as a more immature figure and not really a traditional father figure for his children. The author describes Mr. and Mrs. Doss as sibling figures rather than parental figures, and the author does this through Mr. Kapasi. Mr. Kapasi says, Mr. and Mrs. Doss behave like an older brother and sister, not parents. It seemed that they were in charge of the children only for the day. It was hard to believe they were regularly responsible for anything other than themselves. So this is showing that they are really not conventional parents. They're not hands-on. They're not super concerned about their children at all times. And Mr. Doss is not really a strong, dominant figure in his children's lives like a typical father is thought to be. He has no real control over his children because they don't respect him and he doesn't discipline them. So Mr. Doss at one point tells Bobby to make sure that his brother isn't doing anything stupid. And Bobby responds, I don't feel like it. And he doesn't move. And Mr. Doss never disciplines him, never makes him do what he told him to do. And this is just showing that he's not very disciplinarian and his children don't respect him. Mr. Kapasi and gender. Mr. Kapasi is depicted on the same level as Mrs. Doss because they both struggle with a loveless marriage and they both feel like their lives aren't very important and their jobs aren't very impactful in other people's lives. And so the author does this intentionally in order to show what a loveless marriage and a life that you don't love can do to both husbands and wives. And so this puts them as equals. The author also tries to reinforce gender stereotypes through Mr. Kapasi because he is a more traditional husband and father figure in the sense that he goes out and he works for his family and he provides the financial support for his wife and children. The author says that he took a job that pays twice as much in order to support his wife and to buy his children a newer, bigger house and get them into good schools and have tutors and have fine shoes and a television. So Mr. Kapasi is trying to provide for his family as much as he can. So the author reinforces gender stereotypes, especially for a father, through Mr. Kapasi, but the author deviates from gender stereotypes when it comes to Mr. and Mrs. Das. They're not strong figures. Miss Das is not very maternal, and so the author is just kind of comparing these two different methods. And the author's use of third-person limited point of view, which only shows the readers Mr. Kapasi's thoughts, is used to shape the audience's perception of Mr. Kapasi. The audience sees that Mr. Kapasi has obsessive behaviors towards Miss Das, even though they're both married. And Miss Das did initially show interest and say that his job was romantic, but at the same time, Mr. Kapasi took all these thoughts to a whole new level, and he was thinking about when her letter was going to get to him, and it says that he had an overwhelming urge to wrap his arms around her. And so it's just showing that this third person limited is important in reinforcing gender stereotypes that men objectify women and think of women as sexual partners, as opposed to Miss Das not thinking of Mr. Kapasi like that. She was thinking that she could use him for her own gain. Reinforcing stereotypes continued. The author shows Mr. Kapasi's hypocrisy. He is willing to have thoughts about Miss Das that are not necessarily appropriate, especially because they just met that day for the first time. And once he knows about Mrs. Das's cheating on her husband and about her shame for this, his feelings towards her immediately change. And this shows that Mr. Kapasi is okay with having inappropriate thoughts about a woman, but he is not okay with Miss Das doing inappropriate things with another man. And so this is showing his gender bias. Miss Das shows interest in Mr. Kapasi's job initially due to her belief that the job is romantic. And so she thinks that Mr. Kapasi has this great romantic job, and she thinks that Mr. Kapasi can help her. So she talks to Mr. Kapasi for her own personal gain. Mrs. Das asks Mr. Kapasi for advice, and Mr. Kapasi tells her something that she doesn't want to hear. And she is immediately uninterested in his opinion, and she turns back to her family. And it says her sudden interest in him, an interest she did not express in either her husband or her children, was mildly intoxicating. When Mr. Kapasi thought once again about how she had said romantic, a feeling of intoxication grew. The author is very intentional about representing both men and women in this story. The author tries to compare a strong paternal figure and a more weak one. And she also shows how motherhood can affect a woman and how it can make her not like her life very much if that's not what she wanted for herself. And this is especially shown because Mrs. Das says that her family kind of planned out her and her husband getting married because their mothers were both friends. And so it's just showing that, marriage and being a mother is not always the best route for all women. And the author is trying to break that stereotype. My first lens analysis question is, how does the author's decision to reveal that Bobby is not Mr. Doss's son at the end of the story affect Mr. Capassi's opinion of Miss Doss? Does this reveal Mr. Capassi's gender bias? My second question is, how does the point of view the author chooses to use help reinforce gender stereotypes of men? And lastly, here is our source page.